I stood by the window with the phone pressed to my ear, watching the wind lift the edge of the funeral dress I'd hung on the closet door the night before. It was navy silk. Simple and quiet, something I thought Beau would have appreciated. I hadn't worn it yet. I was still waiting on the time and place. Riley answered after the second ring. Her voice was steady, almost cheerful. "Oh, hey, Evelyn, hi," I said. I wanted to ask what time is the service. I wasn't sure if it would be private or... There was a pause. Just long enough to feel unnatural. Then she said, "Oh, we buried him yesterday." I blinked. "We kept it small," she added, almost sweetly. "Just close people. Did I forget to tell you?" The way she said it. Light. Polished. As if forgetting to mention a funeral was like forgetting to return a borrowed sweater, sent something sharp and cold down my spine. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My fingers tightened around the phone as if it were the only thing keeping me upright, on the couch behind me. The sympathy cards from Beau's co-workers were still unopened. The shoes I'd planned to wear sat neatly beside the door. My hand rested on the back of the chair where I'd ironed his childhood photo into a small frame, thinking maybe I'd set it next to the guest book. I cleared my throat. "You buried him yesterday, she replied. It was beautiful. Really peaceful. I didn't ask who was there. I already knew. Her family, maybe a few friends from their side. Not me, not his only living parent. Not the woman who had sat beside him through every fever and hospital visit when he was young. Not the one who had once sung him to sleep while standing on aching feet. "I see," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. There was silence on her end, a comfortable kind of silence, like someone who had just ticked off the last thing on their to-do list. When I hung up, I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the mug I'd filled but never sipped. The dress hung quietly in the bedroom, untouched, still waiting, still believing it had somewhere to go. It was then the weight of it hit me, not just the loss, but the decision they made to keep it from me. It started with a late rent notice. Beau had just moved in with Riley. This was before the engagement, before the silence. He called me one night, voice low, ashamed, said they were a little short. Just that once. I transferred the money that same evening. No hesitation. Then came the groceries. A week later, Riley texted, asking if I might be willing to help stock the fridge. I did. I sent a box through a delivery app, eggs, fresh greens, almond milk, because she was trying to go dairy-free. The thank you was brief but polite. I convinced myself that was enough. The bills followed. Internet, then electric. When their car broke down, I covered the repairs. I told myself it was what any good mother would do. When they got engaged, I cried, not from joy, but relief. Maybe now things would turn around. I even offered to help with the wedding just a little. Riley said they didn't want anything big. But somehow I ended up paying for the venue deposit. I told everyone it was a gift. I told myself it was an investment. But as the months passed, I felt Beau slipping. Calls grew shorter. Visits were rare. When I did see him, he was polite, but distracted, like a guest in my home. I'd press food into his hands, ask about work, offer leftovers for Riley. He always smiled and nodded, but the warmth was gone. Or maybe I just imagined it used to be there. Even when I sensed it, I didn't stop. I kept sending birthday cards with checks inside, Christmas gifts, groceries during flu season, little texts just to say I hoped they were okay. Sometimes Riley would respond. Most times, she wouldn't. And yet, I never considered stepping back. I thought that if I stayed useful, they'd remember I was family. If I stayed generous, they'd love me enough to keep me in the room. I thought I was building a bridge, But now, sitting in my kitchen while the dress I bought for my son's funeral hangs unworn, I see what I was actually building. Not a bridge. A path. A one-way trail that led directly to my own exclusion. I stared at my untouched coffee and realized I wasn't just grieving my son, I was grieving who I had been to him, and who I had never been to her. A week passed before I heard from either of them again. The call came 7 days after Beau's funeral on a Monday, just after noon. I recognized Riley's number before I picked up. I didn't hesitate, but I didn't rush either. I let it ring twice. Hello? Her voice was tight, the kind of polished urgency she usually saved for her social media videos. Evelyn. Hey, sorry to bother you. I know things have been heavy, but I just wanted to check, did you forget to send the rent? She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't say anything about the funeral or about Beau. Just that, the rent. I didn't speak right away. I stared at the dried dishes in my sink and let the weight of her words settle. She mistook my silence for forgetfulness and filled it quickly. It's just our landlord's getting aggressive. He said we're late, and if we don't send it this week, he might start proceedings. You usually send it by the 1st. I assumed, maybe. With everything going on, I closed my eyes. Then I said, with a voice so calm it surprised even me, didn't I tell you? There was a pause. Tell me what I only help family. She inhaled like she was about to speak, but I didn't wait for the reply. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. My hands didn't shake. Not this time. The room was quiet in the way grief sometimes is still. Dense. Airless. But beneath that silence, something stirred. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't doubt. It was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. I stood, walked over to the window, and watched the wind brush the tree Beau used to climb when he was 9. The branches were thinning now, but they still held. So did I. That evening, I opened a blank notebook and wrote a single word at the top of the page. Tally. Then I started adding it all up. The notebook filled faster than I expected. $500 a month in rent for 43 months? $21,500. Groceries I rounded conservatively, maybe $150 a month. Sometimes more when they were sick or having guests. That added another $6,000. $2,000 for their wedding venue deposit. $800 for Riley's dental emergency. $1,000 toward Beau's car repairs. $200 in cash for their anniversary dinner. $300 for a last-minute phone bill. $250 for a surprise baby shower gift I never actually saw happen. $300 for an air purifier Riley insisted she needed for her allergies. It all added up. Every little excuse. Every time I thought, well, if this is the last thing they ask, the grand total came to $38,650. I stared at the number until the ink began to blur. Not because I was crying, but because my hand had started shaking from writing. And not from sadness. From rage. It wasn't the money. I would have given twice as much if I'd ever once felt like it meant something to them beyond convenience. But that was the thing, wasn't it? They never asked out of desperation. They asked because they knew I'd say yes, every time. The thank yous had always come wrapped in assumption. Riley's texts were always sweet, just sweet enough, but I realize now they never came unless she needed something. There were no calls to check on me, no visits without a reason. I'd been treated not like a mother or even a person, but like a reliable line of credit with a soft voice and sentimental guilt. I drew a box around the final number and closed the notebook. This wasn't grief anymore. This was documentation. I walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the file folder where I kept Beau's old school records and hospital receipts. Then I added a new label on a fresh folder and wrote in block letters, Whitmore, expenses, tomorrow. I'd be calling the bank. The woman at the bank barely looked up when I slid my ID across the counter. She typed something into her computer, asked me a few routine questions, and confirmed what I already knew: my account had multiple recurring transfers to the Whitmore household. I asked her to cancel them all. Every last one. When she hesitated, I leaned in and said, "They buried my son without telling me. I'm done paying to be forgotten." She nodded, quietly. No more questions. I left with a small stack of receipts and the first clean breath I'd taken in weeks. That afternoon, I drove to an office tucked behind a strip mall near the pharmacy. The lawyer had been recommended by a neighbor years ago. Loretta Marquez, mid-50s. Sharp eyes. No nonsense. She greeted me kindly, but not softly, which I appreciated. She listened as I explained what had happened. I left out nothing. She took notes quickly, occasionally glancing up to make sure I hadn't lost my place or nerve. "I want to revise my will," I told her, "and I want to make sure they can't challenge it later." She nodded. "Then we put it in writing. We witness it properly, and we keep a copy somewhere they'll never touch." She didn't ask why I was doing this now. She didn't need to. It was written all over me. When I got home, I started gathering documents, passbooks, insurance forms, letters. Somewhere in the back of my drawer, tucked beneath an envelope of old receipts, I found something I hadn't seen before. A folded page in Beau's handwriting, dated 2 months before he passed. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't finished. Just a few lines. "Mom, I know I haven't made things easy. I should have stood up for you more. I should have called Riley." The sentence trailed off. No apology. Just the outline of one. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for something to click. Closure. Maybe. Or forgiveness. But all I felt was the space between what he could have done and what he didn't. I slipped the letter into the folder marked personal and reached for my phone. It was time to change the locks. I was slicing apples when I heard the front door open. At first, I thought maybe it was the locksmith returning. He'd mentioned needing to come back to adjust the deadbolt. But when I stepped into the hallway, I saw Riley standing in the doorway, holding a folder, flanked by 2 men I didn't recognize. One was younger, nervously adjusting the strap of his laptop bag. The other was in a suit. "You still had keys," I said, not as a question. Riley didn't answer right away. She looked around the living room like she was checking for someone. Then she smiled, that careful smile of hers. "We were worried about you." "Evelyn," one of the men stepped forward. "I'm Richard Lyman, legal counsel for Mrs. Whitmore. We're here under concern for your well-being. Riley tells us you've been exhibiting unusual behavior: financial withdrawal, social isolation, paranoid ideation," the younger man added. "We'd like to speak to you about assigning a temporary financial conservator, just until things stabilize." I folded my arms. "You're in my home without permission." Lyman smiled like that made it better. "We entered with keys provided by your family. We had no intention to alarm." I reached for the drawer by the entry table and pulled out a crisp envelope. "These are updated legal documents from my attorney. Will, power of attorney, bank protections. All filed and notarized last week. And those keys." I nodded at the ones still in Riley's hand. "They don't work anymore. I had them changed yesterday. You got lucky. I hadn't tested the bottom lock yet." The silence was satisfying. "I'd like you all to leave," I said, voice steady. "You don't have legal access to anything in this house, and I'm of perfectly sound mind, unless you'd like to try proving otherwise." Riley looked startled for a second, just long enough to see it wasn't going how she'd planned. Then her lips parted, like she was about to pivot, to charm, to spin it into something softer. But I was already walking toward the phone. "I'll give you 5 minutes to be out of my house. After that, I call the police." They left in 3. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No towering ceilings or echoing footsteps. Just 4 walls, a long table, and chairs that creaked when you sat too hard. Riley wore black again. Not mourning black, but strategic black tailored. Serious. Sympathetic. She sat beside her lawyer, whispering something, nodding as if this was just a routine inconvenience. Her face was composed, professional. She didn't look at me. When the judge entered, we all stood. Then it began. Riley's attorney spoke first. He painted me as a grieving, aging woman, overwhelmed by loss and confusion, said I'd been isolating myself, that I'd cut off communication, that I'd stopped supporting family obligations. He used words like erratic and impulsive. He implied I'd been manipulated by outsiders. He didn't mention the $38,000 I'd spent over 4 years. Riley took the stand. She dabbed her eyes as she talked about Beau. Said she missed me. Said she never meant to exclude me from the funeral, that it was a last-minute decision, made under stress. Then she looked directly at the judge and said, "I've always seen Evelyn as a second mother. That's why it's been so painful to see her fall into this decline." When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I didn't try to match their performance. I simply handed over the file notarized will, bank statements, receipts. I spoke clearly. I explained the timeline. I listed every transaction I'd made in support of them, and every attempt I made to maintain a relationship. Then Carla stood up, my neighbor. She told the judge she visited often that I was lucid, strong, deliberate, that I cooked my own meals, managed my own affairs, and helped her with her own taxes just last month. The judge took a long pause before speaking. The court finds no evidence of diminished capacity. Ms. Calloway's financial decisions are her right to make. Petition denied. Riley's lips tightened. She didn't cry this time. Outside the courtroom, I didn't say a word. I didn't look at her. I didn't wait for Beau's name to come up, or for some last-minute apology to fall out of her mouth like grace. I just walked past her and pushed the door open. The sun outside was unkindly bright, but the air was clean, and my name was still mine. Carla came by the next morning with 2 paper cups and a sleeve of butter cookies. She knocked like someone who already knew the answer, gentle but certain. "I figured you'd need something warm," she said, handing me the cup. We sat on the porch, watching the breeze lift the corners of the garden bed. For a while, we didn't talk, just sipped, just breathed. Then she said, "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, not since I stopped paying her mortgage." I turned to her. She told everyone I was sick, that I was losing my memory, even brought a lawyer to my door once just like your Riley. I didn't ask for more, but she gave it anyway. Told me about the years she spent waiting for gratitude, for softness, for proof that love could come back around if you just stayed patient. Said she waited too long, that when she finally said no, it was like flipping a switch neither of them could unflip. Sometimes I think she loved the version of me that didn't ask for anything. She said, "The one who paid and smiled and disappeared when asked?" I nodded. I knew that version of myself too well. We laughed once, just once, at something small. I can't even remember the joke, but it felt honest. It felt clean. There's a particular kind of relief that comes from being understood without needing to explain. Sitting beside Carla, I didn't feel like a woman who had just walked out of court. I didn't feel like someone who'd been betrayed, or pitied, or written off. I felt seen. We finished our coffee in silence, but it wasn't heavy. She stood, patted my hand, and told me she'd be back next week with lemon bars. After she left, I walked inside and pulled out the draft of my new will. I read it again, slowly, making sure it still said everything it needed to say. Tomorrow, I'd sign it. I signed the final page without ceremony. Just ink, a witness, and a quiet nod from Ms. Marquez. No inheritance for Riley, not a cent. Instead, a portion of the estate would go toward a scholarship fund named for Beau. Not for the man he became at the end, but for the boy I raised, the one who loved books, who once stayed up late talking about becoming a teacher, the one who used to ask me if the moon looked different from every window in the house. The scholarship would go to students who had aged out of foster care, or ones who had no contact with their families, kids who carried the weight of being forgotten. It felt right. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been. Anger, I've learned, burns too quickly. What stays is something quieter, a kind of steel beneath the skin. I wasn't building this to punish Riley. I was doing it to tell the story myself. I wouldn't be remembered as the woman who wrote checks and got left out of funerals. I'd be remembered if I was remembered at all as someone who changed direction when she needed to. Ms. Marquez slid the papers into a folder and smiled, the kind of smile that said she knew this had cost me more than money. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time. I watched people pass parents pulling toddlers into crosswalks, a man eating a sandwich on a bench. Life continued. Not because of my decisions or in spite of them, just because it always did. When I got home, I placed the signed will in the fireproof box in my closet, right above the folder labeled Whitmore, Expenses. I closed the door. Then I stepped outside, carrying only the letter Beau had written and never sent. It was time I said goodbye in my own way. I walked to the lake just before sunset. Beau's letter folded carefully in my coat pocket. The water was still. No one else was around. Just the trees, the soft stir of wind, and the hush that settles when the day finally lets go. I sat on the same bench where I used to take Beau when he was little. Back then, he'd bring crackers in his fists and toss them one by one to the ducks. He used to ask me if lakes had feelings, if the water knew when someone was sad. I unfolded the letter. Mom, I know I haven't made things easy. I should have stood up for you more. I should have called. Riley. That's where it ended. No punctuation, no follow-through. I read it aloud anyway. When I was done, I struck a match and held the corner of the paper to the flame. It caught slowly, curling, hissing. I let it fall into the metal tin I'd brought with me. When it was ash, I scattered it into the wind, not into the lake, into the air. Like a whisper, this was his funeral. Mine. I didn't cry. I'd already done that in quieter rooms. Behind drawn blinds, this wasn't about mourning anymore. This was about reclaiming a goodbye that was stolen from me. I thought of the dress hanging in my closet, still unworn, still waiting. I'd give it away now. Someone else could wear it. Someone who hadn't been uninvited from the ending of their own story. I whispered into the wind. I forgive you. Then, after a pause, softer still. But I never owed you this. As I stood, a breeze lifted through the trees. Not harsh, not loud, just enough to remind me the world was still turning. Even without answers, even without closure. And I was still here, fully, finally. When I turned back toward the house, I didn't carry